Guys, welcome back to another episode of SAP UI5 from scratch. So in this video, we'll talk about routing and navigation. So we're going to implement our navigation from our home page to our details page and back. By the way, if you are new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. Also, make sure you stick around to the end because I'll share with you 3 tips about SAP UI5 routing and navigation. Alright, without further ado, let's get started. As a review, in our previous episode, we've discussed OData filtering, sorting, and grouping. We also implemented some fragment or reusable user interface in our project. So that's why our orders table can now be searched, sorted, and grouped according to the user's preferences. And in this session, we'll talk about navigation overview and how to implement it in our project. In older web applications, navigation is handled by the server and evaluated depending on the URL requested by the client. For example, our client requested a page from the server. The server then sends the HTML page to the client, which is displayed to the user. If the client requested another page, the server will then reply with this request and send another HTML content, which will be displayed to the client. But in single page applications, only the initial page is requested from the server, and that HTML page is displayed to the client as well. But any succeeding requests will only contain data about that page or any component of your application, which is very lightweight rather than retrieving the whole page or HTML. And it's the client's job to perform business logic on how to display the appropriate data to the user. In SAP UI5, the module that handles the navigation is called the router, specifically the SAP M routing.router. In our orders table, we'll use this class to handle page navigation and pass data from one page to another. Our current setup, if we look into our home view.xml, you will see that we have a shell and an app control in our view. We need to transform our application into a more robust format. So by design, it's recommended to separate your app control so that you have one entry point for your application, and then let the router handle the replacement of the views so that when the user navigates to your application, the user will see the appropriate page. For example, router will handle placing the home view XML to our app control, and then when the user navigates, router will automatically replace those views with appropriate view or the next page that the user is visiting, and then router will also replace that view if necessary with other views moving forward. This design enables faster rendering of our application since we simply swap the views that the user is currently viewing rather than rendering all the pages at once during loading. And since we are moving to routers, this enables us to manipulate or create dynamic navigation in our application. Alright, with that out of the way, we can now proceed and change our app to that structure or design that we want. So what I need you to do first is to create an app view.xml. So this will act as our single root element and view placeholder. Let's open our workspace. So to do that, we can right click our view folder and then create a new file or a SAPUI5 view, and then in here enter app and click next, and make sure you override the existing component. Finish. You can see that our web IDE created a file called appview.xml, and it also created another controller file. is the app.controller.js. Since we already have the view for our home and details page, we can simply delete this pre-made app tag in our home view.xml. So we can just copy. Don't forget to copy the ID because we'll be using this ID later on. So we just remove the shell and the app and the pages. Also remove the closing tags. Save. Don't forget to beautify. And then in here, just paste the ID from our home view. And then we can simply delete the pre-made contents since this will be replaced later on by router content. So don't forget to save your project and rerun your application. As you can see, we can only see the header part of our application. This is because SAPUI5 don't know how to render the page properly since we remove the home view.xml in our app container. So the next setup is to add a router navigation so that UI5 will know that the home page should be displayed when the app view.xml is rendered in the screen. Now open your Manifest.json. So I have a Manifest.json. Let's maximize this window. And then in your Manifest.json, you have your sap.ui.5 object. And then you'll see that there's a root view configuration in here. And then this configuration tells SAPUI5 which will be the entry point for all the views. So let's just change this configuration and point it to our app view.xml. And then also don't forget to change the ID. Make sure it matches the ID that we assigned in our app view.xml. So it's app in here, copy that ID, paste it here. Okay. We are simply telling SAPUI5 that when you load your first or your root element, always load the app view.xml and find a control in that file with the ID app. So let's rerun our application. To verify that our root view is loaded by our SAPUI5 application, you will see that in your network, there's an app view.xml. But since we haven't attached any view, once this root element is rendered by SAPUI5, we don't see anything in our screen. We have a working root view. Next is to set up the routes in our application. So think of routes as an address in our application. So every time you visit page 1, you will be directed to a view which is similar to an address. And then if you go to that address, you will find objects or contents about that location. So go down to your routing object and then you will see that there's the routing object, and under that routing object is your routes configuration. These routes is actually a collection or an array. So in here, you will specify each address or each route in your application. So in here, we have the route home with the pattern route home as well. So let's change or update this configuration. So let's just simply name this home. And I want to update the pattern into an empty string. And then the target points to target home, which you can find at the bottom. So the name is the name of the route. So every time you reference this in your code in SAPUI5 later on, you will use the name to get this route. And then the pattern is simply the string in your web browser URL. So in this example, any contents after the pound sign or the hashtag will be interpreted by SAPUI5 for patterns. So in our example, you will find that there's an address called /employee. So there are a lot of patterns in UI5, and we will use another one later on in our details page. So in our example, if we go back to our home router, it simply means that any address that doesn't have any string after the hashtag is pointing to the home address or the home route. Since our home views or pages are usually the default page, so our home shouldn't contain any pattern or parameters yet, because we want the home page to be the default page the user will encounter when the page loads. So on runtime, SAPUI5 Router class will intercept this pattern and parse the pattern. SAPUI5 Router class will intercept this pattern and then parse the pattern string, and if the pattern is empty, so in this example there's no string after the pound sign or the hashtag, then it will simply match this route to the home page or our home route. Then it will load the appropriate view. So we have a route like an address, which you simply have the details of the location, but how can we load the actual view or the page that we want to display? So this is where target comes in. In our configuration, we have this target home, and if you scroll down, you will see that there's a targets configuration, and one of those properties inside that object is the target home, and it's like routes, and this object is a collection as well of properties. In here we have a target that points to home page, home view, home page, but in the bare minimum you can actually delete all of this configuration and just leave the view type and the view name, just to simplify the things for our router. So this simply tells SAPUI5 that if the target is being loaded by a route, which is the home route, then the files that you want to load on your screen will be the home view.xml. Notice that target in routes can be multiple. So if you want to load 2 sections in your page, you can do that. You can simply load 2 targets at a time or more. And this is very useful for master detail layouts, where you have your list on the side, which is one target, and then you have your details on the right side, which is another target or view in your routes. So let's try to rerun our application using this configuration. And now, as you can see, our home view loads, and it's now being placed inside our app view.xml. In your network as well, you can see that after the app.view.xml, you will see that the home view.xml is being loaded by SAPUI5 since it hit the route or the router intercept the request, and it find that there are no patterns after the hashtag in your URL, so it will load the target home view.xml. So let's review what we've done here. So we just told SAPUI5 that our root view is app view.xml, and then we provided routes or address that the user will interact, and then one of those address is named home or home route, and then the pattern for that route is empty because it's the default page or the home page of our application. And once the route is being hit by the user, I'll just simply load the target home, which is the actual file that we want to display. This design enables us to create different routes, and then you can reuse your views or your targets in any dynamical way you want to mix and match. So it just depends on to the needs of your application. So our next focus is to navigate from the home page to our details page. Right now, if you press one of the order items in your table, no event is triggered and no navigation is being done. We need to add a press event in our view.xml. So if you go down to your table control inside the items, there's a type navigation, and then we can add a press event to this navigation, and then let's give it a name on press item. Your home controller, just implement the function. Now if you press an item in your orders table, an alert will be displayed to you. It means that we hit that event and we are now ready to implement the navigation from home to the details page. So let's add a new route in our Manifest.json. This time the address that we want to implement is the details page. And then the pattern is, for example, let's just name this details because that's the URL that we want to display. And then the target is a collection, so I'll just, and this time instead of target home, I will load details. Let's just rename this just to make it clear and easy to read. So let's rename it to target details and then paste that target detail. Okay. So now we have another address called details, and if we visit that page, it will simply load the target details, which is pointing to the details that XML.view. Notice that instead, this time we provided a pattern called details. So unlike the home route, which we don't have any pattern after the hashtag, if we visit the detail route, it will append a /details to our URL. So it means that we are visiting the next page or the details page. Okay, so we have a route to our details page, but the only missing part is the actual navigation from our home page to the details page. So to implement that, so let's go to our home controller.js and remove the alert message and replace the alert message with the source code. So what we've done here is just get the router class and telling the router class that I want to navigate to the details page, and this one is the router name. If you go back to your manifest, it should match the name of the route that you want to execute. So in here we have detail, and then the second parameter is just basically the parameters you want to pass. So it's null for now, so we don't have any parameters yet to pass to the details page. So save this one and rerun your application. Okay, so if you press one of the items in your orders table, you will be able to navigate to the details page. For now, let's just press the back button if you want to go back to the home page. Another note in here is that when you check the URL in your home page, you don't have any hashtag string parameters in your URL, but if you press one of the items, you will see that it adds a details hashtag /details to your URL. This is because of the route patterns we provided in our Manifest.json. Okay, so let's enhance our details page because we don't want to click the browser back button every time. We can actually add a back navigation to our details page. So this time, open your details page, and in your details page, don't forget to remove the app and pages since we already moved the app control to another file. And then let's add the property show nav button. So this will create a back button in your header part, and set that to true, and then implement an event called nav button press. So this will trigger a function that you can implement every time the button or the back button is pressed. So I'll just name this on nav back. Okay, so we have our back button. Next is to go to our details controller.js and implement the on nav back event. So create a function in here, and I'll provide the code in the description box below, so you can just copy paste that code. So what we did here is basically, first we need to get any history from the browser, and then we also get the history on the previous history from the browser. So we check that history. If it's not undefined, so it means that the user visited another page before the details page, we simply go back to that page. And if the previous hash is empty, we simply point the router to the home page. So it's like a fallback in case the user directly visited the details page. So don't forget to save and rerun. So let's navigate to our details page. As you can see now, there's a back button at the top. You can simply press that one and it will navigate back to your home page. Looking at our home view navigation, we can actually declare the static SAPUI core UI component as a dependency. So we can just simply copy this one and move it at the top. And then declare that as a parameter. Then you can simply delete this one, so it's much shorter. We can also do this for our details page. So you can see we have UI core history and UI core component, so we can move those static references as dependencies. So I forgot to add a routing on my history, so let's just do rerun and check if everything works. Still working. So every time we navigate, we can now navigate back. We just move the dependencies and remove the static references. Alright, so everything seems to be working, but there's a problem. Every time we press an item in our orders table, we don't have any information on that item. The details page doesn't really know which item we pressed from the previous page because it already swapped out the home page with the details page. So how do we pass information from our home page to our details page? So to do this, we go back to our Manifest.json, and this time we can actually declare in the pattern section the parameters that we want. So to do that, let's add in a details route a parameter, and I will declare a mandatory parameter, sales order ID. Okay, so let's try to rerun our application and navigate one of the items. Okay, so it's not working anymore. Let's check our console. As you can see, we received an error and it tells us that the segment sales order ID is required because in our manifest.json we declared the mandatory sales order ID. So the router will also check the parameters during navigation and it will stop you if the parameters are not sufficient enough for you to navigate. Okay, so let's go back to our source code in our home controller. So it forces us to add a parameter sales order ID. If you remember from our filtering and sorting topic, we can actually get some information about the event source or which control triggered the event. So we can simply add an OEvent function, OEvent parameter instead, and then get the current item about that order item in our UI. So to do that, order O item and then O event that get source. So this will return the actual table row in our orders table, and from here we can simply get the data from the binding context. So to do that, let's modify the null and change that to an object, and then inside that object you'll provide the property sales order ID, which is the parameter that we declared in our details route pattern, and then assign O item, which is the current row, but we want to get the data about that current row and get binding context, and it will return an object, so I'll just get that object, and then in that object there's a property sales order ID. The sales ID property is actually on your home view.xml, which is binded to our object ID identifier. So every time the user selects a table row, we will simply get the item or the row, and then using the binding context, get the information about that object and use that sales order ID and pass it to the details page. So save and rerun. The home page, select one of the items, and as you can see, it now navigates to the details page. If you investigate the URL as well, you will see that it now contains additional parameter, which is the sales order ID of the item we just clicked. So it's instead of /details, because of the pattern in our Manifest.json, it appends the sales order ID in your URL. Let's try to select another item. Let's check if it changes. So as you can see, that the order ID change. Let's verify that. Let's select 18. And then you see, still 18 on sales order ID on your details route parameter. So okay, we can pass data from the home page to the details page. That's great and all, but how can we catch the sales order ID in our details page? Because right now, if you click one item, we didn't do any specific thing about that information in our details page. So to get the sales order ID, the data we pass from our URL, we can implement in our details controller. And in your details controller, we want to get the data and listen to the route patterns as well. And if the current details page is being loaded, we can simply implement a fallback function and intercept the routes data and use it in our view. So to do that, in our onInit function, we can actually use the getRouter UI components. So let's get the router, and then once we have the router instance, I want to listen to the route, specifically the detail, so make sure it matches your route name. Paste it on your get route. So every time the details route is hit, I want to attach a function. What we'll do here is that every time the pattern matches the details route, we're telling the router that please call this method. And pass the context. So where is the on route match? We actually need to implement this one. Similar to your filtering and sorting, you can have an information about the source of the event, but this time we are specifically interested on the parameters rather than the source, since the sales order ID is parameter of the detail route. O event that get parameter, and then you have arguments, and then that sales order ID. So the sales order ID should match your Manifest.json parameter. So for now, let's just alert this SID or this sales order ID. So go back to your application, go back to your homepage, and refresh. Alright, so let's try to navigate one of the items in our orders table. And then as you can see, it prompts us the sales order ID for that order even before the page is displayed, because in our source code we implemented the callback function attach pattern match in our on init. So it means that before the page is being rendered to the screen, it will implement or it will run our source code. So let's go back to our source code again. So what we did here is just simply tell the router I want to listen to the detail route, and every time a pattern matches the detail route, please call this onRoute match function. And on that onRoute match function, we just got the parameter from the arguments, and we are interested specifically on the sales order parameter. That's what we output in our alert message. Alright, we have our homepage, and we can now navigate and pass parameters to our details page. So for now, we'll stop right here, and I want you to experiment on routes. So in the next video, we'll move on to implementing the details page, because our details page right now is empty. And since we already have the sales order ID, we can use this ID to pull in details about the current order item. For the 3 tips on SAPUI5 route and navigation. So first tip is to make sure use of different route patterns appropriate for the needs of your application. So if you go to your UI core routing route, there's actually several types of patterns that you can use. So there are hard-coded patterns. So it's basically telling that you need to exactly provide that pattern. And then there's also mandatory, the one that we use. So it's product, and then you have your mandatory enclosed by curly braces. You also have your optional parameters. So optional parameters are enclosed by colon. So if the user provided, if you provided the ID or not, it will run. It will not prompt you for an error. And then you also have query parameters. So these are used for several types of key value pairs. And then you also have your patterns that are similar to hashes. So if you have your different hashes, you can use this one. But most of the time, you only use the optional parameters and the mandatory parameters. So second tip is don't abuse the route. So don't pass any unnecessary route parameters, because this will make your URL harder to read for the user. So if the user bookmark your URL and the user cannot read the URL because of so many parameters you provided. And make sure that all unnecessary values, just do the pulling in of data later on in your actual controller rather than passing all the parameters in your route parameter. Okay, so most of the time, only the key properties in your OData service are the ones passed to the route parameter. And third tip is make sure that you provided all route that the user needs to visit, so that it doesn't show a missing page or a 404 page. Okay. Alright, so our home page is done. Our details page is on the way because we already have the sales order ID on our details page. We have completed our navigation and routing in our application. So in our next video, we'll work on another type of data binding, which is the element binding, which is very relevant because in our details page, we need to show the details of the current order, and it will be displayed using the element binding because we are not dealing with collection and we are not dealing with one property. So don't worry, it will be very easy for you guys since we already tackled the data binding in the previous episodes. If you don't have any background on that, please check the links on the video. I'll just place the link to that episode. We are now closing into our final application, so we are almost done. If you have any questions, just drop a comment below, and please don't forget to subscribe or leave a like if you like this video. And that's all for this video. See you in the next video. Peace.